it's Kawaii Waiku, and in this video I'm going to show you part 1 of making Virtuous contract. I started off by printing out a template of the sword, cutting that out on printer paper, taping it all together, and then cutting out the entire length of the sword on poster paper. I used poster paper because it's thicker and easier to trace onto foam. So once I had that, I traced the entire cutout of the sword onto foam. Since I only had little sheets of foam and not one piece of foam that could fit the entire length of the sword, I had to basically divide it up into like 3 separate pieces. The entire sword was going to be 2 sheets of foam thick, so I cut out each piece of the sword twice so that I could glue them both together in the end. In order to give the sword stability, I used a wooden dowel to fit in between the 2 pieces of foam. Since the wooden dowel is straight and the sword has a slight curve to it, I ended up having to cut the wooden dowel in half and then use an epoxy to secure them both together. Epoxy putty is basically a 2-part mixture, the 2 parts being different colors, a light gray and a dark gray. Once you mix those 2 pieces together and let it dry for a few minutes, it solidifies and becomes as hard as steel. Once I got a good mixture, I just wrapped it around the ends of the 2 pieces of wood that I wanted to stick together and let it sit. So once the epoxy had solidified, I laid it down on top of the pieces of foam and I traced out where I was going to end up drilling a little notch for the wood to sit nice and snug in between the 2 pieces of foam. Next, I used a Dremel to carve out a little space for the wooden dowel to fit in between the foam. With the space all carved out, I applied barge cement to both sides of the sword. And then I placed the wooden dowel in the notch that I created earlier with the Dremel. After that, I sandwiched the wooden dowel with another piece of foam. So here I'm using the poster board template from the beginning to create a nice line for me, basically to use as a guide while I'm dremeling to know how far in I need to Dremel so that I'm not dremeling too far. And then I took my Dremel and I cleaned up all the edges. Once it was all nice and Dremeled, I took a heat gun and went over the entire thing with the heat gun to smooth out the surface of the foam. Since I did have to separate the sword into 3 separate pieces of foam, there were some seams that I needed to cover up. So in order to cover that, I used Quick Seal. I just applied it to each of the seams with my finger, and then I used water to kind of like smooth it out a bit more. So this blade had a few details on it. Again, I used a template that I found online and I cut out the appropriate shape of the template on paper. Then I used that paper template to apply it to foam and cut that shape up on the foam. Then I used barge cement to glue both pieces on. The next piece I worked on was the crossguard. For this, I traced out a piece of foam in the shape that I wanted, cut it out 3 times, and glued all 3 pieces together to get the final thickness that I wanted. I did the same thing for the handle, except I used a thicker foam. It's about 1/4 of an inch thick, because I wanted the handle to be a lot thicker than the blade and the crossguard of the sword. Since the handle was going to need stability as well, I took another wooden dowel, traced the shape of it onto all 3 pieces. For the middle piece, I actually just cut out the entire area that I traced because the wooden dowel was going to fit nicely right in that spot. I used the same epoxy putty to connect the wooden dowel from the handle of the sword to the wooden dowel of the blade. To make sure the epoxy hardened in a straight line so that the sword wasn't crooked, I set the wooden dowel on top of the handle just to make a nice even surface for it to harden on. Then I took my handy dandy barge cement and glued all 3 pieces of the handle together, with the wooden dowel inside, of course. In part 2, I'm going to be doing a little bit more dremeling, adding a few more details onto the sword, painting the entire thing, and then wrapping the handle like a samurai sword. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in part 2. Also, shout out to Author Jay for making this awesome mix that I used in the background. If you liked the music, then be sure to check out his SoundCloud.